Welcome to Certain Point of View's Another Pass podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Just go to certainpov.com.
Thanks, folks, for tuning in to Another Pass podcast. I'm Kay Sakin, and tonight with me we've got Ben Milton and Addy Thomas.
Hey!
Shocker. I know for everyone. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Amazing Spider-Man series. What was good, what was bad, and how we would remake it to make it a bit better. Because I didn't think these were particularly good, but I think there were some good moments in there, and certainly a lot to talk about. So with that, I guess we've done a few series before where we've worked our way backwards, but I think this one, the movies are such like weird clusterfucky 180s from each other. Like the first one happened and the second one's like, how do I fix everything that happened and do a totally different thing? So why don't we start with Amazing Spider-Man 1 and like talk about some ideas about it and then move on from there. So Ben, do you have some thoughts?
I have two thoughts for Amazing Spider-Man 1. Either change everything about it or change one thing about it.
What's that one thing?
I would place it in college instead of high school. Every one of these actors is way too old to be in high school. It's completely
unbelievable. I've got a very similar note on that one.
Completely unbelievable that any of these people are in high school. That Gwen Stacy is working in Oscorp and getting tours.
That was ridiculous. One thing that always bothered me is that Gwen Stacy is a high school intern who isn't just answering phone calls at Oscorp.
Or fetching coffee, right. She's giving tours
or
and
filing things.
Right.
Even a college intern should be like, no, it's like, here's our stack of old documents. We need to keep them for legal reasons. Can you make sure that they're all alphabetized?
Right. Yeah, so that was my biggest complaint about it, because I went back and watched both movies today just to because I was like, I think I didn't like the first one, and I think there was things I really liked about the second one, and I came away with very different impressions. I actually really liked the first one. I thought it was a really great personal origin story. Mm-hmm. Now, look, I didn't necessarily want to see, and I don't know that I would make an origin story for Spider-Man, but when you consider that but do you think they're just Spider-Man, he's Jewish now, which makes sense out of New York. If you're coming off of the Raimi series, and I guess you want to say that this is a totally different, this is a reboot, so it's not the Raimi series. So I guess you're kind of obligated to do an origin story, although I think that could have been done better.
Yeah.
But for an origin story movie, this one works really well for me.
Yeah, I was fine with Martin Sheen as Uncle Ben. Mm-hmm. You know,
Sally Field as Aunt May is fantastic.
Yeah, I like that. I was fine with what they did, in that aspect. I was fine with an origin story. I'd be okay with them not doing an origin story moving forward because I don't want it to get played out like the Wayne's death.
Yeah, I mean, at this point now, Spider-Man, I think, is the default, they're just going to do another origin story again. We don't want to see Spider-Man's origin again, which we've been very refreshed that it sounds like they're not doing that with the new Spider-Man movies.
Right. Which I think we're at the point now where that's okay, but I don't think we got to the peak of all right, I'm tired of seeing Uncle Ben die.
Origin is so simple, and so pure. Like, I got bit by a spider, now I have spider powers, and I'm a hero because I failed to do something good. Like, we don't need to embellish it. We don't need to modernize it. We don't need to, because it's, no matter how modernized you make it, it's going to be ridiculous. Like, it's not supposed to be like, oh, here's a really plausible excuse. If they wanted a really plausible, Spider-Man origin, they would do Spider-Man 2099. They would do a different series. Mm-hmm. But the classic Spider-Man is just this is a pure accident happens to person, and he's an average person. Now, what propels him from being an average person to being a hero? And that's the fact that he learns with great power comes great responsibility. Because the whole thing about his villains are always they're very similar. They're middle of the road people, people who are just citizens. They're not career criminals with the exception of a few. And then they do something that pushes, they gain their powers and they make the choice to be bad. And that's to contrast with Spider-Man, who made the choice to be good. But it's not just he's innately good, and it's not just all that.
Yeah, and my big problem with both of these movies, because my one big criticism of the first movie is really a criticism of both movies, is that Spider-Man, Peter Parker isn't necessarily an average person. There's a little bit of a predestination thing going on with him. because of his parents' role.
Yeah, and that
in the
definitely
experiment.
muddies the nature of who Peter Parker is.
And I was not a fan. That was the thing that I didn't like, especially because the payoff for the second movie
Well, the payoff is
ended up
really
being
bad.
so bad.
Yeah. Oh,
but
yeah.
that
Let's refrain it to the first movie though
Yeah,
for the
but
moment.
co- coming back to the first movie,
just watching it in the first movie, though, as I would rewatch it today, it actually works pretty well.
it only works because if you have the relationship with him and Connors. You can still have Parker's dad be involved with Oscorp, but not necessarily making it predestined for Peter to be Spider-Man in some sense.
But that's not revealed in the first one.
Yeah, but I think you can cut.
But it is heavily hinted
Yeah,
at.
there's a lot of implications. There's a lot of intrigue around it. You have that little flash of was it a mid credits or after credits scene with the
at the or not the asylum. Yeah, the
in
asylum.
prison.
Yeah.
The guy with the hat.
Credits.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel like Sony has not had the balls to do a true post credits
but
scene.
the thing,
Right.
but again, but for the main movie itself,
Yeah, the main.
yes,
Yeah.
they're there, but it's not like
Yes,
it's predestination. I think is a really strong word for what happens to him.
Well,
Yeah.
but here is the thing in the first movie. Everything is coincidentally linked up. Like Gwen is coincidentally the assistant to Connors, who coincidentally works at Oscorp, where coincidentally they have a Spider-Man or a spider facility with super spiders, where coincidentally this happens to be the company that sells spider webs. That coincidentally,
Yeah.
and then
I
when
guess
it gets
welcome
even
to
worse when you
comic
get to the
books.
next.
I mean,
but it's not that isn't how comic books work. It happens when one writer tries to do one story, but if you look at the history of Spider-Man, there's all these crazy things, and then retroactively sometimes they try to tie it together.
Yeah,
But,
that's like making Kingpin the guy who killed, Matt Murdock's dad. Oh, wait. They did that before, didn't they?
well, yeah, but more accurately, it's like making Joker
In a bad
the person
movie.
who killed Batman's parents.
Yeah.
That starts to stretch the world that they live in to be unbelievable.
It's too small.
Which
okay.
Here's my thing on
in a comic book series where you have infinite number of issues that you can stretch things out and tell these stories forever and ever and ever, and we're perpetually in the second act. You can do that. In a movie, you're confined to an hour and a half, 2 hours at the most to tell the story. Mm-hmm. I was okay. I agree. It does make the universe smaller, but I don't think at that point in time they were necessarily convinced that they were going to try and make a Spider-Man universe.
Not in the same way that they had for the next one.
Right.
And I have thoughts about that for the next one. But talking about Amazing Spider-Man 1.
Yeah.
I agree. I think the origin story was well done. I think it was entirely unnecessary. But I thought it was well done.
Yeah.
The stuff with Uncle Ben was good. And what was a really good detail
I like
was
Connor's stuff,
his
too.
shift from being a vigilante to being a hero, coming to understand that vengeance isn't the driving force. That, he goes from being Batman to being Superman.
Yes.
Taking that up and actually becoming an actual
And
hero.
having Gwen Stacy's dad being sort of the guiding force of that,
Yeah,
I thought was
helpful
really
details.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you too, because and that's why I said it's a minor issue for me in the first movie, but I actually really, really like the first Amazing Spider-Man. I don't think I would change. Really,
I would make him in college.
Yeah,
That's the
I
only
like
thing
the
I would
college
change.
idea.
Because here's the thing, I do think coming at this movie, they were hurt by the fact that they did the origin story again because the audience, it was so soon. We're not.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking about if this was a standalone movie. But there is context. It's not Batman Begins where you had a bunch of really bad movies in between and a franchise that started and then flopped.
Yeah,
and then
it was 8
a
years.
big year
Yeah.
gap. We're talking about only
3
a couple
years,
years.
yeah. 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. The stretch of audience time didn't feel like it was necessary.
Agreed.
So
Right.
my thoughts on it, I agree about the college thing. I wouldn't mind if Spider-Man was kind of like James Bond, where you could just pick up and do a story about the character and not have to set up, here's all of his origin stuff.
Yeah.
You
Like
might
that
have to,
about most heroes.
most
honestly.
superheroes generally, but Spider-Man is up there in terms of how recognizable he is to the average audience, especially after the Raimi movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, you could just have Spider-Man be a character.
Right.
Sure, spend a few minutes to set up okay, so here's Aunt May and here is our new iterations of all the characters so that we understand this is the world we're in now. But everyone understands who those players are.
Right.
And so I agree. I would do a college story. I've been batting this idea around in my head. Do it as a midquel, for the first Spider-Man movie. Like, don't be explicitly set in that timeline, but kind of the way that Incredible Hulk could be a sequel to the Hulk movie, like the Ang Lee Hulk movie. Like, set this one in college, because during the time, or like in the Sam Raimi movie, there's that time jump, and it's not really explicit, but it could be a few years actually, where he kind of becomes Spider-Man and like is off and about and being Spider-Man, and then the Green Goblin shows up, and things are thrown awry. But during that stretch, you could do a story of him in college. Like, he could still be living at home, and like there's some issue.
Well, you could do.
I think the problem is
because they did his senior year in high school. You could easily change that to his senior year in college.
Yeah, but then you also have so one of the things I find really good about this movie was the relationship and the chemistry with him and Gwen Stacy. Mm-hmm. If you try to set it in Sam Raimi's timeline, you technically can't, because Gwen Stacy is in Spidey 3. And what's going on with Mary Jane? What's going on with Harry?
I wouldn't really like hold it too hard to it, except we're right now just like dissecting this movie and what's good and bad about it.
Right.
Like, if we're kind of trying to repitch it from a starting point, like, this movie came about because they tried to get the Raimi movie to have a fourth movie, and it didn't really come together because they couldn't pay them enough money. / they were worried that like it was now tainted, and like how is it going to go? And eventually it like started to stall out, and finally they had to like whip it together really quickly. Otherwise they would lose the rights. So the question is like, how far back do we want to go right now? Do we want to be like, all right, so my pitch
exactly
would be like,
this is what I said. I would either completely redo this story completely from scratch, nuts and bolts up, casting, story, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Or I would change one thing.
And I don't think you need. I personally don't think you need to like burn everything down and rebuild. I mean, yes, there's some issues with like Andrew Garfield is definitely way too old to be a high schooler. I agree.
So is Gwen Stacy.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, all right, let's say we set it in college. You could theoretically cut out the origin story. I like it, but it doesn't need to be.
It could be flashbacks. You could do it in flashbacks.
Actually, for it is, what if the movie opened with the funeral for Uncle Ben?
Right.
And then the movie follows his initial period of time as Spider-Man, which we didn't really get in the Raimi movies.
So it's like Spider-Man Year One.
Yeah, basically. Less so in this one, but an idea I had. Are you guys familiar with the series Untold Tales of Spider-Man?
No.
It was a really cool series that they did in the 90s by Kurt Busiek. And it was, every issue was set during a time period of other Spider-Man issues. So the stories were all high school Spider-Man stories I think they ultimately got to like the very beginning of his college career. But every so often they would do a timeline just so that we were clear where these fell in that chronology. And they did things to tie details together and sort of set up like, oh, this explains why this weird continuity issue happened there, or this, or here's a thing that would have happened because they had this time gap, or here's a really extreme thing that happened in this really narrow time frame, and this is how we fit it all together. I think it's like basically a writing exercise that he came up with after doing Marvels, where he had to do the wedding and then the mutant riots, or like the wedding of the Fantastic Four and the mutant riots, and realized that they had to happen on the same day. And then was like, I wonder what else could happen in that kind of window. And it'd be kind of cool if you did this sort of as like, and their marketing did this too, where it's like, here's the untold story of Spider-Man. This is what their commercials were doing. Like, tell the story of Peter Parker going from like, my uncle just died, I'm so angry, to being Spider-Man, because in the Raimi movie they just jump into him being Spider-Man.
Right.
Like he was the human spider before that. Like,
right.
And it doesn't have to be the Raimi verse. Like you can divorce yourself from that, but this is a Spider-Man story from the time where Spider-Man is fresh off of his uncle's death before he's truly come into his own as a hero. And you could do that story. You could do him as a freshman in college who just lost his father figure. Like, his professor could be Connors. He like warms up to Connors, finds out about like stuff going on with Connors in a separate thing. But that's a natural relationship right there. Like, they were setting that up in the Raimi series to be like, Kirk Connors was his teacher,
his professor.
Yeah, and that was that was really implied, and that's why I think they went with Lizard, because they'd been working on scripts before that for Lizard. And spend some time with him. Like, they wanted him to be like, here's a new surrogate father figure, and then he betrays you to become like a monster. like you could have worked with that. Like you could really develop that period, but have it be not an accidental connection. Like have it be like he is now hurting. He is looking for a father figure, and this professor right here like shines to him because he is a smart kid, and like that, he's teacher's favorite student, and is also in his own way hurting because he's like without his arm, and he's like has these like emotional problems as a result of that. Maybe some kind of PTSD. That could have been a thing. Like in this modern era, like talking about like a post like war on terror kind of thing, like someone who like went off to active duty and came back. And that's
missing a limb.
Yeah, like that's. I think that was his shtick. Like he like was in World War II and like lost his limb. Or
was that the
Korea.
Original story of?
Like I mean, it was
the lizard.
It was definitely a war injury.
Was it? I don't know that I ever knew how he had lost
because they
his
had
arm.
to retcon that detail. But like all the '60s characters, it was just like World War II was fresh, and so was Korea. Right. Like that. Like Ben Grimm was like a fighter pilot. In a like they all just like went to generic colleges and had these kind of interactions. Like Captain America wasn't that far out of time. He was just someone who was like the leader of their people. Now
he was like what was it like 10 years out or even?
Yeah,
out?
I mean that's why it was cool to have a hero like Reed Richards with like gray hair. Like he was just like he's a vet. Cool. Like it might have been Korea and then it might have been shifted to Vietnam, but like
I guess I never knew the actual story of how Kirk Connors lost his arm. I don't think I've ever seen anybody even mention it. It was just like, and he doesn't.
He definitely lost it. And I'm like 90% certain that it was a war wound initially, and they probably have done different versions. They may have done different versions between the first couple of issues.
How about this as an idea? How about sort of the movie kind of from Kirk Connors' standpoint? Him like starting the movie with him losing the arm and seeing him lose the arm and going through that journey with him of the PTSD and the trauma and being this brilliant scientist, kind of a Stephen Strange-esque story of I can't do the thing that I've been so great at because now I'm half of a man with this missing arm. That could actually be a fairly interesting Spider-Man story.
Okay, yeah, I mean...
Because we already know the origin of Spider-Man. We already know the history of Spider-Man. We already know that Peter Parker chooses to become the hero. We don't, like you said, we don't need to see that again.
Right.
But what if you did a Spider-Man, or a Spider-Verse told from the perspective of the villains?
That's what I was kind of excited about with with some of their ideas for their expanded universe. You know, the idea of a Venom movie, to finally see from the perspective of a villain rather than from a hero. I always thought a Superman movie would be interesting from Lex Luthor's perspective as the protagonist and Superman as the antagonist instead. But actually, coming back to Connors real quick, he was in the U.S. Army. He was a surgeon who lost it.
Thank you, Internet.
In a wartime blast. So,
Yay!
there you go.
Yeah, no,
that makes sense.
Pretty
it
set
makes
on
totally
that,
sense. But yeah, I mean, and you could totally do that with Iraq.
Right.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
That, and make it and modernize it and make it interesting and relatable.
And maybe has a weird relation with how science works now because like his or
was exposed
like whatever.
was exposed to some weird cutting edge science while he was over fighting.
I like the idea of him being embittered because that actually sets up a better reason for him to hate and to lash out, especially when he's given these like lizard regenerative powers. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the problem. Like,
lizards aren't necessarily like I have a lizard at home. It's not really an aggressive animal.
Yeah, like the thing is, like the lizard that they present in this movie, he just becomes all of a sudden, I need to make everyone lizards because reasons, and then they don't like really do much good with that. Like they have that scene where he like infects a couple of like cops, and then we never cut back to them. Like that would have been a great like they've started to transform and attack people. Like we don't even get that, which would have been such a cliche, but still perfectly like supervillain kind of thing to do.
When the reality is they're in New York and it's cool at night, they probably just like tried to find some heating lamps and just hung out for a while and waited for crickets. Because that's what lizards do.
They're hanging out with Mothman near some light bulbs.
Just hanging out underneath a street light, like shivering, eyes barely able to stay awake.
Not to steal plots, but like you could do stuff like, say, like the things that they did with Man-Bat in the animated series, like on Leather Wings, where he's like starting to have the transformation, but it's not permanent, and he just has this compulsion to like finish it and like come to his final form. And he's like stealing stuff that's like chemicals related to that. Like,
right.
Again, that's straight up stealing the plot of a Batman episode, but like it's a good one. Like it works,
Right.
And it makes sense.
yeah. Like, and it makes sense for this character.
Yeah.
You know, to be like, oh, I have my arm back. And I like, especially if he starts off like just having his arm back and isn't the full lizard, and he's like starts doing things related to like keeping his arm because he can feel, or like he actually sees evidence of it like starting to atrophy. Yeah, atrophy. Like something like that would lead to him like doing more and more extreme versions of whatever drug he takes, and that finally turns him.
Desperate to say to become a full human again. Like if he views himself as half of a man, he's not really a full man anymore because he's lost his arm, so his machismo is injured and his ego is injured, and so he gets his arm back and he feels like a whole human being again. But then he's seeing it decay and atrophy, and so he goes out and commits these crimes and these atrocities. No, he doesn't.
No.
He goes from I got my arm back, and so he goes to stop the guy from Oscorp from testing it out on. VA at the VA.
Oh, right.
And attacks everybody, and it changes on the bridge and attacks everybody on the bridge.
Right.
I would have liked some transformations because think about this one. What if he had those PTSD flashbacks every time his arm withered away? Like, and he relived that same injury. Like, that could drive a person mad because if it happened a couple of times, like we don't really see it that often. Like he transforms like what, like twice or like three times?
Yeah.
Like if it happened where like he got his arm back but it decayed by the end of the day, and like he was witnessing his arm fall off
and feeling that pain,
and it looked
horror.
like the scene that we saw at the beginning of the movie, and then like another time and another time, and he's taking harder and harder versions of these same drugs. Like that could do some really interesting stuff with making him a compelling villain, because right now he's a cipher. Right. Like he's just not. He doesn't have motivation. Like we get cool scenes, like that fight scene in the library with Stan Lee as a cameo. One of the best Stan Lee cameos ever. Great scene. Mm-hmm. Like they do good stuff with all their characters. Like there's nice little moments there with some good action scenes. Like
and the physicality of that fight scene is fun too.
Like the physics are generally pretty good. Like the web slinging is great in that movie. It'd be nice if he was wearing a good costume while he swung around in it. But
you didn't like the costume?
Oh no, I hated it.
Really?
Oh yeah.
What about the costume did you not like? Because I thought it was pretty good.
For what it was. Okay, so stepping back on a few details. So just the straight up costume, I thought the line work was just like overdone. I thought it was like, we need to separate him from the classic Spider-Man design, so we're just going to put a bunch of new like random details all over.
Okay. Did you like at least that they went to the web shooters versus the organic webs?
I'm okay with web shooters. I don't like two key details about them in the movie that they did. One, he bulk orders the webbing from Oscorp. Where you're like, how does Oscorp and the FBI not just automatically know who Spider-Man is? Because he's the only civilian for this like commercially developed like aircraft carrier safety thing. It's like look, if your ship's about to, or your plane's about to fly off the ship, like you can web it, and if someone's falling from, like, fire departments can use it. Now this one high school kid ordered like thousands of tons of the stuff. Like I thought that was so dumb. I hated the fact that there were like muzzle flashes when he fired it off. I thought that was so dumb. It was like, let's make this look like badass and cool, but it's a web shooter. Like it's supposed to be kind of creepy and like a little there's so many elements. There's so many elements of like, let's make Spider-Man cool. Like that's why he's a skateboarder and he like has to go thrash to like let off some steam.
That was
like, it's like we're making him Edward Cullen and we're gonna go with someone who looks like kind of that moody bad boy-ish. And he doesn't feel like a nerd, and he doesn't feel like a wallflower. And he doesn't feel like really like someone who's out. Like he doesn't even feel antisocial. Like
I don't know if I go that far, but
he's a little too cool.
He's not.
And he's a little quippy.
He is in the second movie. In the first movie, I disagree with you on that.
No, I'm not talking about Spider-Man. Like, and sure, he comes out... Like, Spider-Man should be the key for him coming out of his shell. Like, I don't need him to be like a bookworm, complete nerd, like stereotype of a nerd from the 50s, but he doesn't have... Like, he doesn't feel like a modern nerd that needs to come out of his shell.
Well,
like,
he's definitely a loner.
He's a loner. Yeah, I think they turned... I think they
But he feels confident in that lonerness.
Most definitely, because he faces
Flash
in his very first scene. He fights Flash in his very first. Gets
he still has the spirit. Yeah,
but I thought that was a refreshing twist on Spider-Man after the syrupy, goofy interpretation of Peter Parker.
Yeah, I'm not saying like let's just do Maguire.
Like, I really didn't like Maguire as Spider-Man. I didn't think he was good. I didn't like that iteration of Spider-Man.
Really?
No. Especially by the third movie. The first movie, I thought it was okay. It was much.
Which part are we going to get into right now?
Here's
the problem. Here's the problem with comic book movies in general, or movies in general, is they have they find a pretty good tone and a pretty good story, and they keep it simple in the first movie, and then they go, we got to top it, and so let's just do more.
Yeah, but the second movie didn't do that.
It did a little bit.
Well, with the whole, like, he loses his powers because of his psychology.
Oh,
sorry,
that's true.
We're talking about the Raimi second movie.
Yeah.
And then him, like, relearning to be Spider-Man. That scene, like, those scenes annoyed the hell out of me.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there, because
Yeah.
it's also weird for his, like, how, like, the moment he gets it back, too.
I'm going to defend the damn dance in Spider-Man 3 right now.
No.
Here's why. Because Peter Parker, being a nerd, but being, like, cut loose, is like the drunk guy who's like, I think I can dance right now. He's not a good dancer. He's not actually that cool. He's doing, like, jazz standards in, like, a modern era. Like, none of this should fit. But he's so damn confident in it because he's got an alien parasite clinging to his amygdala. Like, that's the saving grace of that scene, because it's not about him all of a sudden, I've got my mojo, I'm cool now. It's him being like, no, I got this. I've had a couple of shots, but I'm pretty good. I know what I'm doing.
Just the overconfidence of that. Taking it back to Amazing Spider-Man, and back to this.
Because I'm sure we'll have another episode.
I think Amazing
for that.
Spider-Man 1 is a little small. But
that works for me.
Yeah.
Well, that part is, you see here, it's a little small, which could be a huge strength. The personal stuff of Spider-Man coming into being a true hero and not just a vigilante, and like that exploration was one of my favorite things about it. Getting into like, here's our deep love story, that starts to make it feel like too much of an epic. The villain being kind of generic and not having really well enough developed motivations, and then kind of getting in like the hinting of the Chosen One stuff, like this like deep coincidence of everything tying it all together, kind of is trying to make it almost seem like he's destined for greatness, or at least he's destined to live out this story. And that those are, I think, weaknesses of it. I
can see where that turns you off. It didn't turn me off in the first movie. It definitely turned me off in the second movie.
Right.
Let's get to that. Let's get to that, because I feel like we've dissected the first one enough.
Let me just say this for Amazing Spider-Man 1. I think you could get away without doing the full origin story. If you want to talk about the period right after Uncle Ben, I think that works really well.
Yeah.
And then follow that story. You can do some more stuff with Connors. I think that's the biggest problem ultimately with this movie, is that the villain just isn't very compelling and never has a good explanation for his things. Like the stuff with him like going to the VA, don't test it, like those are almost moments of him being developed, but then it just goes away in the rest of the movie, and those are problems.
And before we get to the second part of this episode, don't forget, if you have other ideas, especially about the first Amazing Spider-Man 1, you can go to our website, certainpov.com, click on Another Pass, and comment on that. See if if you disagree on these ideas, especially the idea of him being the chosen one, or is it is it strength being the too
is
small?
Connors the typical Marvel underdeveloped villain?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all of that, certainpov.com.
I'm going to throw this one last part about Amazing Spider-Man 1. When I came out, I remember thinking, oh, wow, this is as close detail-wise as you can get to a Spider-Man 2099 movie, because there was so much about it being like uptown, where there was like these huge buildings, which are not the way that like classic Spider-Man was built to like be around. With like there were a lot of like extreme lights, and there's cops around, and there were a lot of like good details. And then this is like very high contrast blue and red color scheme at multiple spots. It was a little dark, but it was still there. And I thought those almost had this like look of like, oh, this is the future of New York instead of like the 60s New York. This is like, we're almost there to the 2099 New York, and you could feel Spider-Man almost getting there, which that was cool. And if anyone saw that too, I would love to hear about it. Or if you thought that I'm just crazy, but I just love Miguel O'Hara, and I would love to see like I would eventually love an actual movie, but we're never going to get it. So Amazing Spider-Man 2.
What a
Addy.
piece of shit.
All right, Ben started before Addy. What are
No, I was talking about Addy.
There's Right here, man. There's so much wrong with this movie.
All right. Let's start.
But what would I change in it?
Well, let's start with what we liked about it first, and like if we can keep it, and then what we didn't like, and if if it makes sense to toss it. What'd you like about it?
I actually really, again, I like the chemistry between Spidey and Gwen Stacy. The Gwen Stacy death actually works for me. I know it doesn't work for Ben.
It worked for me. I just thought it was hilarious.
I think the scene itself was fine. I think
the circumstances that created
spontaneous.
it. The circumstances that created it with Goblin, because Goblin is so mishandled in this movie, along with so many other things.
Oh yeah.
But I think the death was. I think that the idea of I was actually fine with. I think you're not a fan of this, but the ghost of Captain Stacy being there messing with Spidey, that actually works for me, because this idea of this is why he doesn't want to get back with Gwen was, I thought, a good obstacle in their relationship, so that when he does make the choice, there is the consequence of her death. I thought that plot thread did work for me. But all of that is stuff of him being Peter Parker and not so much Spider-Man. Like, it was all about, like, her deciding to go off to school in, what was it, France or London or whatever it was?
I think it was London, right? You just saw it today.
It was London.
Yeah, it was London, yeah. So, like...
It's everything with Gwen constantly is like... You're not a real person. You're not, like, these are not options that people just have in front of them. Where it's I'm going to be the intern.
But she's in a very wealthy family.
She's in a very wealthy family.
But how wealthy is she really? Like, her dad's a cop. Like,
top cop.
Yeah.
Top cop, but still, like...
Yeah, they live in a really nice apartment.
They do.
If they wanted,
really nice
they could
apartment.
downgrade, like, what that top cop... Or, like, sorry.
Mom must be loaded.
Yeah.
Maybe. But, I mean, like, sure. Like, if you're going to be, like a captain, I guess you might.
Well, maybe
be,
he was connected, and that's how he got the job.
But then he shouldn't come off as so blue collar the whole time.
Yeah, then you don't
Did
care.
he come off as blue collar?
Well, he's Dennis Leary. Comes off as blue
Leary.
Oh, yeah,
He's
that's
like
true.
the king of blue collar.
That's fair.
He was blue collar before Jeff Foxworthy.
Well, yeah, I was about to say the only way you could be more blue collar was Jeff Foxworthy. Man, wait, can you imagine that casting choice?
I'm going to need you to step away from my daughter. You might be a Spider-Man if you can shoot webs out of your legs.
Well, here's the problem. You let her die.
But again, that still worked for me. Like that conflict of not wanting to get back into that relationship, and then the tragic consequence of it resulting in her death. I like that thread.
See, I think the problem I had with that conflict stems from the end of the movie before not feeling like he was actually going to have that problem. Like that he was trying to like honor the word, but he just really wanted to get with it and didn't really care. Like that was how the end of the movie felt, or the previous movie. Mm-hmm. And I think the continuity between the two movies is sort of the problem. The fact that it is the sequel and they try to tie in these plot threads makes the fact that this movie is a complete 180 from the previous one. Like everything that's good about this movie is the exact opposite things from the previous one, and everything that's bad about it generally are the opposite things plus some shared bad. Yeah, like for example, like I love the costume in it. I thought it was really, really well. Like it looked great. It was like the best classic Spider-Man costume. I mean, yeah, sure. With the Civil War one, it's there's all these like great details, and we gushed about it on certain POV for quite a bit of time, just about like, oh, this is such a great like Marvel Universe version of this costume. But Amazing Spider-Man 2, it really looked like the costume from the comics. Like it was without really any compromises. It was just those details, and that I thought was great. I thought the fight in Times Square looked amazing. I think the reasons for it were horrible, but the fight itself was really cool.
The effects were good.
Yeah, like the later fight. When he fights Electro, generally it's pretty
looks
good.
Cool.
And
the effects in both of these movies are actually very good.
I would say it's a stronger point for
the
2.
Second, yeah.
Like 2, they really threw their money into it. The first one, they were like, "Get this out the door,"
right?
But it still looks really good.
It does, but there's something that's kind of inventive.
There's more of a wow factor in the second one.
Exactly,
there's more of a wow factor.
Yeah,
but the lizard. They do a really good job with the lizard.
I didn't like his look.
I didn't like the way he looked, but the effects were good.
I don't think so.
Watch it again,
I thought his skin looked really kind of not consistent. Like I thought the textures sort of were messy throughout.
I thought it looked pretty good today when I watched it.
When the last time
I saw for what how old is it?
Not that old. It was like 2013.
Because that came out the same year as Avengers, right? The first Avengers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's 3 years old?
No, the first Avengers movie.
Well,
Yeah.
you just said 2013.
Yeah.
It's 2016.
It's earlier than.
It's got to be earlier than 2013.
When did Dark Knight Rises come out? That was the same summer.
Look it up. You got a computer right in front
Come
of you.
on, man.
There's
You guys
no
got
way it's
phones,
only
too.
3
It
years
was a
old.
2012. Like it can't be.
I think
would
it's
put
2012.
2010. It might have
It
been 20. No, it's not 2010. It was definitely 2012 at earliest.
looks good.
12.
It was 12. Okay.
Looks good.
Summer 12. Okay.
It looks good. It looks good. I'm telling you, it
Yeah.
looks good.
I think the first one they
fine
get away
the
with a
effects
lot of
on
the effects.
Lizard.
Well, they do a lot of great use of shadow.
Yeah, I was about to say
Yeah.
they do a lot of stuff at night, whereas the second or Amazing Spider-Man 2, their night scenes are all really well lit. Like it's Times Square and there's like
There's tons of neon
So
and there's tons
the
of
night
light.
component doesn't play into it. Like you can use shadow and darkness to make up for bad CGI. That's what they did with like the Ang Lee Hulk movie. They spent like the first half of it
I mean, to be
being
honest,
darkness so that the first time he comes out into the light, you're like, okay, I'm ready for it at this point.
Yeah, I mean, but who wants to see Spider-Man fight Electro at noon? You know, like that's just kind of
Right, yeah.
it's kind of boring.
No, the visuals definitely are more spectacular, if I can use that word, in this Spider-Man.
Not amazing?
No, they're spectacular in the second Spider-Man.
You might say superior, but
I might, but the story is so awful.
definitely not
Yeah.
sensational.
No, it is anti-sensational. It is the worst. It is such a bad movie.
Yeah.
top
It
to
gets-
bottom.
Electro
It gets caught
only-
up in a web of.
I love where you're
poor
going
choices.
with this. I really do. I'm so proud of you right now.
And the
I'm trying to
only
think of
bitsy
every
spider
Spider-Man
thing,
spinoff right now.
I sat down and this afternoon as I watched this, and I tried to think of what I would keep out of this movie, and there's only one thing: the casting. Other than that, I would scrap this entire movie. It's just total garbage, top to bottom. The love story is garbage. The Electro story doesn't make any damn sense,
Electro
and it's
story's
just
awful.
completely ridiculous.
The Osborn stuff I thought was dumb. Although one thing
Yeah.
that came out of it is, you know who would actually make a really good Peter Parker? Dane DeHaan, who plays Harry
Yes.
Osborn. Like he actually would be a very good Peter Parker. He basically
think
plays
so?
evil Peter Parker in Chronicle.
Yeah, but he's got the again. But again,
He's
he's
too
got the
good
evil.
looking. He's
but
too
he's got
good
the evil.
looking.
What?
Yeah, I don't know if I agree
I
with
don't
that.
know.
I think he's got the evil quality going for him. That's the
Like
problem.
I could see going gay for Andrew Garfield. I don't know if I could do it for Dane DeHaan. Like,
Yeah, I
like
don't
maybe
know.
if it was dark
don't
and
know
I
what
was
you're talking
lonely, but
He's got like that brooding sort of like bad boy thing going for him.
That's what people thought about James Franco, and that look where that went.
I don't know where you're coming
I
from.
don't know.
right now.
I don't know. I've had
Yeah.
at least 2 whiskeys.
You've
and 2
you've had a little
beers.
too much to drink.
So
do you
I
want us
just-
to edit this out?
No, I'm fine with it. I don't.
Addy, take it back.
I don't like. I don't like Dane DeHaan as Peter Parker.
Yeah,
okay, well,
I don't find him attractive. Yeah, I don't think he's too dark for it. Like there is a certain darkness to him, which is what works in Chronicle, and which is why they cast him as Goblin, and it doesn't work as Goblin. But
But imagine him if he and obviously career wise he was not in a spot to play Peter Parker when the first one came out. Imagine if he was.
Nope.
Hold on, just imagine, like, just to go back to Amazing for a second.
Okay.
Imagine if he had been cast in that, but the story is about someone who is a little dark, coming to embrace the light. Like he's a little too driven by vengeance, coming to understand that it's not about like catching the bad guy; it's about protecting the weak.
But we already
my problem
established that
is
story.
My problem is I
Well,
keep
but
on.
I'm saying in the previous movie.
he
in
ne-
one,
Yeah,
maybe.
The
I'm
problem
not
is
talking
I
about
keep-
him. You should recast him right this second. Like in that movie, they should have just
Yeah.
flipped it. But I was saying that like Dane DeHaan, I thought would have been a good Peter Parker type.
Yeah, I see. I'm already
don't
seeing him
see
as an Anakin. That would have been good instead of instead
Yeah,
of
maybe that's
a
part of the
straight
problem.
Peter Parker.
Andrew Garfield feels very Hayden Christensen to me.
Ooh, really?
Yeah,
Really?
Like I was like trying to picture.
can
He
see
has
that.
these
When I was
weird
doing
sort of
notes, like,
tics to him when he's talking. That's really annoying to watch when he's Peter Parker.
When I was doing my notes, I kept like trying to picture him, and then I kept realizing I was doing pictures of Hayden Christensen in my head.
I see
was
that.
like, oh no,
Yeah.
I see that.
That's bad. And
They are
this is
similar in
purely
their
aesthetic.
style.
Like,
No, their style, the way they behave, the way they carry themselves, and their build is similar.
yeah.
It is similar. I see that.
Another thing I did like about Spider-Man and not Peter Parker was that he was quippy. I think they went too far with it, but I did like that he actually made jokes because that was completely the thing missing in the Raimi movies.
Right.
like,
and in the first one,
and
he
the first
wasn't
one to a
very
certain
funny.
degree,
He was
yeah.
hardly funny at all in the first.
Yeah,
He was a
at
little
least-
bit more
he
quippy,
talked-
though, than
he talked
Raimi's
more than in the
version.
Raimi movies. The
Yeah.
Raimi movies, the big problem was that they never felt comfortable having him talk with the mask on. Like, he makes a few jokes, but it's like muffled, and it's like, wait, hold on, aren't you're ADRing this? Like, I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
that's CGI right now. Like, you're not even like, it's not like he's wearing the mask and talking. Like, you
Right.
can get away with him being a little more verbose. Like, that's the character. And
Yeah.
they didn't do that.
Yeah. I mean, Spider-Man's appeal has always been how much he talks. So to stay away from that was off-putting in the Raimi movies, and I missed it in Amazing Spider-Man 1. I thought they went overboard with it as a sequel because it was missing so much in Amazing Spider-Man. To all of a sudden, like the opening
jokes
scene that,
were so bad, though.
No, I'm okay with that. I'm
Yeah.
totally okay
Yeah,
with
he
that.
doesn't have to be a good comedian.
Yeah,
I don't mean it that
want
way. but-
Louis C.K. writing his material.
No. But in terms of like, it was so bad because like you were making fun of something and you weren't enjoying it either. Like there was nothing to enjoy in that movie. Like he's making jokes, but you don't like Electro. You don't like any of the characters. You don't like the story. So those jokes don't work because there's nothing to like in the story.
Well, so here's my big problem with the movie as a whole, which is that I feel like it's a kitchen sink movie. Like, at this point now, Marvel, so the first one came out, Avengers was just coming out. No one was quite sure if it was going to be a success. Like, at this point, they had Iron Man, that was a huge hit. Hulk was not. Thor and Captain America, neither of which were they were financially good, but no one really felt like, oh, the world is together yet. Like, Avengers is what brought it all together. After that, they then made Amazing Spider-Man 2, and they're like, oh shit, we need to catch up. And we know all about the Sony blueprints for all the different spin-offs and multi-franchises that they wanted to do with this really dense world that is Spider-Man. Spider-Man property has so many characters. Because it was the most popular Marvel series for a really long time. And even to this day, it's a really popular character. So there's a lot of stuff attached to Spider-Man. You can do a full movie franchise on just Spider-Man characters. Same way you can do it with X-Men. And they got over ambitious. They were like, let's throw everything in there and get it in.
Sinister
So
Six.
we're gonna do the exact costume, and that's cool. But they were like, okay, it worked for Iron Man. Let's do the exact costume, and we're gonna do quips, and we're gonna have a lot of villains out there. We're even gonna do the death of Gwen Stacy scene. Everyone loved that scene. It was a big emotional scene. We'll do it. Okay, cool. And they throw everything in there.
Yep.
That's the problem with the movie. They don't pause to be here's the structure that makes sense. It's just put as many things in one spot as possible.
Agreed. Totally agreed. And this has sort of been my critique of a lot of sequel movies of, we got to make it bigger. There was one villain in the first movie, so now we're going to have 2, maybe 3 villains. Calm down. Just tell a goddamn good story.
wait,
if you're going to build a universe, let me finish this. If you're going to build a universe, build it one character at a time. Build it one story at a time so we care about these characters enough so that when there's a payoff and a big event, much like how comic books work. Comic books work small story, small story, small story, small story, big event. This movie felt like it went from small, good told story in Amazing Spider-Man 1 to big event. I don't give a fuck about any of these people. None of this makes any sense. That was my opinion of Amazing
I've got a
Spider-Man
counter
2.
pitch on this one, which is doubling down on the villains. So I agree with you generally. But I think one problem with superhero movies in general is that they need to set up here. This movie is about now the real threat emerges, and this person is such a colossal threat. How will they ever rise to the challenge of this one particular threat? And I think that every movie has to do this to a certain regard. But the way that the hype machine works for movies, that they're like, oh, now all your villains are circling you and they're coming to destroy you. What would be really interesting is if they did a movie where they just doubled down on Spider-Man existing in the comic book Spider-Man world, where there's supervillains everywhere, and they kind of do that to a certain degree. They set up Rhino, and they have other characters in there. But and this is my big tie-in for the Untold Tales of Spider-Man reference. This was a thing that was happening. The whole plan to create supervillains, as being a teaser for here, we're going to do a Sinister Six movie, was actually, this was already happening. We've already missed a few villains because their stories aren't even aren't even big enough to talk about right now. Vulture just happened and he's in prison now. But kind of the way they've sort of set up for like Suicide Squad era Batman, where like he's had villains already. He's already been doing stuff. Like we haven't watched every step along the way. He didn't defeat Two-Face and then retire because we weren't watching a movie in that time span. So obviously he wasn't doing anything.
Right.
Like what if the movie really doubled down on that detail and had an Osborn setting it up behind the scenes? Like, why are supervillains showing up? What is happening? And like the mystery of why there's all these things happening is that someone is actually setting the whole stage. And that allows for a Green Goblin reveal at the end of the movie to actually have payoff, because he's been, like, we've been watching it, but like Spider-Man has not been aware of him this whole time. And the final reveal of a Green Goblin is the culmination to the real villain.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, that would
Like,
be
what
a
if Electro is just the one who
improvement.
can't capture because he's electric and he can disappear into the power grid? And so that's the one that keeps recurring. And so he's been trying to catch this one, and maybe he's being burned a little raw by all of this, like the same way that like Nightfall Batman was worked so raw by fighting all the Arkham Asylum criminals that when Bane shows up, like Batman never had a chance, because we're not talking about Batman with prep time and at 100%. We're
Right.
talking about Batman with zero prep time and about to pass out just because, let alone that he's about to get into a fight.
Right.
Like if Dr. Octopus, if Green Goblin, or not Green Goblin, like if the Executioner, like in Untold Tales of Spider-Man, they set up this idea that there were a lot of criminals who were stealing things that were instrumental to the Green Goblin like weapon suite. And that some of them were testing out devices. So like there was the Executioner who had like a Green Goblin style glider, and he had like a powered like axe that he used, and he was just straight up a henchman for Green Goblin. Like there was Scorcher who had like a fire based suit, and it was basically like all of these were like prototypes of like one part of the tech suite that is the Green Goblin armor, because he's got all these gadgets. It's not just one thing that does it. And at the end, it's not like a Megazord of like, here's all the supervillains you fought, now all come together in this one villain. But like Green Goblin is revealed to finally be the person who's been setting all this stuff up. And sure, we could do Harry, and Harry could have. Well, the problem is like Harry having any like personal connection with Peter and screws up the first movie. Like everything they try to do in the second movie is bound by the first movie, and that makes it worse.
Yep.
Because it doesn't make any sense, because the first movie was setting up like nothing. It was just like, okay,
was just
we need to do a
existing.
Spider-Man movie,
Yeah.
and we'll do the origin story again, which the reason why that's bad for that movie is because it wasn't setting up a bigger world. It was just like, here's a couple, I'll throw a few things out there, but
the only setup it tried doing was the stuff.
yeah,
with
it wasn't
with
like
the
they had
parents.
a grand plan, which could have justified a new origin story.
Right.
The second one has a big plan, or at least it has like a marketing sheet, like people have called it a trailer for the movies that Sony wanted to make.
Right.
Which is fair.
Yeah, but so imagine a world where it's Peter Parker really being Spider-Man and really trying very hard, and that way when like yet another supervillain shows up, it's not because like at this point he's now like the way the actual movies play out, he fights the Lizard, it's implied he fights some criminals between then, including a Russian gangster, and then he fights Electro and the Green Goblin all in like a very short period of time, and then someone shows up in a powered suit of Rhino armor. Like that would be a much bigger deal, because it's only like number 4 in like the actual list of supervillains out there. But if it was a world where supervillains were constantly attacking New York, and they really like embrace this idea that Spider-Man lives in that world, and say 50% of them were Osborn creations. Like it's not all Osborn, because that's too much. But like Electro could be like one of the non-Osborn ones, which is why it's so weird. Like why he's so elusive, and why he's not tech specifically. He's actually a metahuman. But like the tech ones are secretly all actually tied together. And maybe like Spider-Man catches them, and the police take them in, and they die. Like whatever tech implants are actually causing the preventing them from being like questioned and interrogated. So there's this mystery about like, why are supervillains existing? Like this isn't a thing that happened before, but now we live in this.
You would kill them off.
Maybe
in
maybe
that
some
idea.
of them, like the ones
Like
who
Vulture would be dead. They'd put him in Rikers and then he'd die.
potentially, yeah. Or maybe Vulture wouldn't be, because Vulture was just like someone who was working on this thing and went crazy and stole it to like this magnet thing that allowed him to fly. But that technology was then the weapon was stolen, or like the wing prototype, or like whatever the harness was taken, and like that became the basis for like the gyroscope in the Goblin. Yeah. But like,
That's a great idea. That's a
like that a lot.
much better take.
And you also have the chance to finally see him kind of take on 3 villains at once or at some point or another.
yeah, because then you can do a couple action scenes that don't have the stakes of like this is your ultimate threat,
right?
But you could do like a serious fight, like that the action scene that everyone loved from the trailer, where he like webs the manhole cover and he's about to whip it into the rhino. Like they could have done a few scenes like that, so that it doesn't feel so cheap that the end of the movie is like just what we saw in the trailer.
Oh, God, that was so disappointing.
Yeah, there's only 2 scenes in this movie as it stands that I like.
The one that made you cry?
There's one that makes me cry, which is Rhino and the little kid.
Yeah.
Because at that point in time in my life, I was a foster care parent for this little boy, so it hit me right in the feels, caught me just right in the feels after sitting through just an awful movie.
Well, and the setup for that scene when Spidey interacts with that kid earlier in the movie
so
too
good.
is good.
It's really like I really love that scene.
Yeah.
And then I love when Gwen Stacy dies.
Yeah.
Addie and I went to see this movie together.
I'm still horrified that you laughed.
I laughed
It's
out
so loud.
That, however, was not unique. I know a lot of people
I know.
I think it's hilarious.
I looked at him and I was like,
who did.
what?
Because the Green Goblin is not well set up. Like, yeah, sure, Harry Osborn
absolutely.
is, but all of the logic for why he becomes Green Goblin or does anything.
Not even Harry Osborn is really set up well.
In the movie, he's at least around the whole time. Like, sorry,
but
I don't
like
mean
this-
to say that like
but the conflict
they explain
over,
his
like-
conflict. I'm saying that's not well explained.
that's true.
I'm just saying that at least we know who he is.
Yes.
He doesn't literally just show up.
Yeah.
Like, But the Green Goblin does. Like Harry Osborn is around the whole movie, but we don't understand why he would fight Peter. None of the reasons that they talk about in the movie make sense. Like the Sam Raimi movie set up 3 movies for a fight between Harry Osborn and Peter Parker.
Right.
And it still didn't feel like it was enough for them to really add blood.
exactly.
Like it felt like they were still they should be friends right now. Like he's a little like, why is he that pissed off? Is he drunk? He might be drunk. Okay.
Yeah.
And that could be the explanation for
I've
that.
known
but-
all of you for almost 10 years. And honestly, I wouldn't fight you the way that Harry Osborn fights Peter. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
There's no history there. And I probably hate both of you more than what Harry has reason to hate
it's certainly
Peter.
an amazing.
what was- yeah.
Right?
Like, it's like, will you give me your blood? No. I understand.
Oh, I get it. Okay.
Like, it is your blood. It's radioactive, right? Yeah, okay,
Right.
okay.
Yeah, all right. It's probably not good for me.
But like, why doesn't Harry Osborn know that he's Spider-Man? Because his dad's company sold him in bulk all of the goddamn webbing.
He bought it with using Aunt May's card, so it's hard to track.
And also, that's kind of the thing. It's like in the trailers they had. It's like, oh, you've been on file for a while. Oh, what? Like, why is that? Isn't that the question of the day? That scene's not in the movie, so we don't have any of those scenes. Like, if Norman Osborn was always going to go after Peter, and like he just happened to die from this disease first. That could be interesting too. Like, what if Norman Osborn was setting this whole thing up and then just died abruptly before he could like be the Green Goblin,
finish it off,
and then like, I mean, it wouldn't make sense for Harry to become the Green Goblin, but at least these are interesting things you could do that are different.
Did you like the blood disease?
Oh no.
I didn't like it either.
I thought it was so dumb.
It didn't make any sense.
The big thing is that why is Harry that worried about it when his dad was like 60 and finally succumbing to it? It's like, you've inherited the same condition, so maybe at some point in 40 years you are going to start dying. Like, he's got a lot of time. I don't know why. Like, they never explain why it would be a big threat for him, and it's definitely not just that he injected himself with Spider-Man's blood, although that does stuff to him. Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Like, it's a weak excuse for it.
It's an awful MacGuffin.
Never explained.
Yeah, it's a bad MacGuffin.
It is.
There's really not. Other than those 2 scenes, there's nothing that I like about this movie. I hate the interpretation of Electro in this movie.
Okay.
Hate it.
Yeah.
There's nothing I like about Electro in this movie.
The look of him, I'm fine with.
I'm okay with the dubstep. Like, it's...
Well, not the Itsy Bitsy Spider.
Yeah.
That was bad.
But like having dubstep kind of themes for
Yeah.
it, like doing electro kind of things. I like the scene of him suddenly realizing that he was on all the TV screens. That was cool. Like,
the discovery of himself and his
like
powers.
in terms of him coming into his own. But the character before it didn't quite make sense. The fact that, again, he feels so betrayed by Spider-Man for a thing that no one would actually feel betrayed by.
Right, and weird obsessive. Like, it seemed to, like, well, the nerd that Andrew Garfield wasn't they went like full on into a weird nerd stereotype that doesn't even feel like a real nerd stereotype. It's just
it was like a 1980s movie, like
Yeah,
a stereotype of like,
yeah.
it was like really over the top.
It was like the Jim Carrey Riddler.
Yes.
What if they open the movie again doing like, let's focus on the villain for a second, and he's super obsessed with with both Spider-Man and Peter Parker, or just Spider-Man. Like, he's so obsessed with Spider-Man, and we follow the movie leading up to the transformation with that in a world where Spider-Man's fighting a lot of villains.
Right.
And then he shows up as a villain who's not tech-based, so he's actually a metahuman just like Spider-Man, which is a little different than most of these supervillains. Mm-hmm. And then we create a world where like it kind of is more compelling, but even then it's not. Like, we need to like explain why he's crazy enough to fight Spider-Man, and like what he.
Well, the thing is, he just needed to be a henchman.
Yeah.
You didn't need it. Not every
Well, and that's
villain needs to
ultimately
be
what he is.
developed.
Yeah,
At the end of the day.
I mean, he could just be a force of nature. Like, once he becomes electric, he like doesn't have the reasoning. He just is a creature of chaos.
loses
like,
his humanity.
Yeah. Like slowly slipping away. But we don't get any of those scenes, and like the fact that he like links up with Osborn and then just becomes his henchman. It's so worthless. Like, he might
It neuters him.
Yeah, I mean, like, the fact of the matter is he's less well developed than like a Power Rangers villain, and that's kind of depressing.
I can't argue with that.
I know.
Actually
I know.
really
I was
true.
thinking
like,
exactly like
oh.
Ivan Ooze. He's up there with like the recent version of Apocalypse.
Oh yeah. Well, anyway, so like this is my pitch, like that world full of supervillains. Spider-Man's like actually an active like participant, and then like Osborn's pulling the scenes behind the strings. That's my main pitch to like fix this movie, because they wanted to have a big world. Like, that part, like, we have to acknowledge what the studio execs would do. They wanted a big world. They wanted to set up potential like spin-offs and sequels. So
Right.
all of these had to be like dropped in there, but instead of like disparate scenes to like put those in.
What if you had the Sinister Six actually form in this movie, like right at the beginning? You know, sort of these guys that are criminals, they're low level criminals, and they form a Sinister Six. They get access to tech, but they don't have any leadership. So that the end of the movie is them failing, but then getting the leadership of the Green Goblin to set up for
future-
another,
Yeah, that could
for a
work.
future movie.
That's not a bad idea either.
Yeah.
My approach for it would be that you would, again, tell the story from the direction of Electro. And it would really be an Electro movie. Mm-hmm. Sort of everything would be told through his eyes of what's happening. Because what we know about this universe was like all the spin-offs were, there was going to be a Venom movie, there was going to be a Sinister Six movie,
And a Spider-Man sequel.
Yeah, and a Spider-Man sequel. So we know that like they were already kind of directing it into, let's tell these stories through the eyes of the villain. And I think I would have started. I actually would have started this movie there and I would have just made it just an Electro movie. I think that we rush too quickly to have these team up movies when in reality the team up needs to happen as like an Avengers movie where it's a payoff of a bunch of other individual movies that can be told and stand on their own as an individual movie. So I maybe would have had nods to some other things going on at that point in time, but I would have made this strictly an Electro movie.
All right, guys, thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts about either Amazing Spider-Man 1 or 2, please feel free to put them in the comments. Ben, Addy, thank you for chiming in on these two. Ben, especially thank you for slogging through Spider-Man 1 and 2 today. Next time, guys, we're going to be talking about Highlander 2. And until next time, stay scruffy, my Nerf herders.
Thanks for listening to Certain Point of View's Another Pass podcast. Don't miss an episode. Just subscribe and review the show on iTunes. Just go to certainpov.com.